History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 3, The Classical Mediterranean. Chapter 7, Jewry and the Coming of Christianity. The first stage of Christian missions permeated the civilized world by sinking roots everywhere, in the first place in the Jewish communities. The churches which emerged were administratively wholly independent of one another, though the community at Jerusalem was recognized to have an understandable primacy. There were to be found those who had seen the risen Christ and their successors. The only links of the churches other than their faith were the institutional one of baptism, the sign of acceptance in the new Israel, and the ritual practice of the Eucharist, the reenactment of the rites performed by Jesus at his Last Supper with his disciples the evening before his arrest. It has remained the central sacrament of the Christian churches to this day. The local leaders of the churches exercised independent authority in practice, therefore, but this did not cover much. There was nothing except the conduct of the affairs of the local Christian community to be decided upon, after all. Meanwhile, Christians expected the second coming, such influence as Jerusalem had flagged after 70 AD, when a Roman sack of the city dispersed many of the Christians there. After this time, Christianity had less vigor within Judea. By the beginning of the second century, the communities outside Palestine were clearly more numerous and more important and had already evolved a hierarchy of officers to regulate their affairs. These identified the three later orders of the church: bishops, presbyters, and deacons. Their sacerdotal functions were at this stage minimal, and it was their administrative and governmental role which mattered. The response of the Roman authorities to the rise of a new sect was largely predictable. Its governing principle was that when no specific cause for interference existed, new cults were tolerated unless they evoked disrespect or disobedience to the empire. There was a danger at first that the Christians might be confounded with their other Jews in a vigorous Roman reaction to Jewish nationalist movements, which culminated in a number of bloody encounters. But their own political quietism and the announced hostility of other Jews saved them. Galilee itself had been in rebellion in 6 AD, perhaps a memory of the influenced Pilate's handling of the case of a Galilean among whose disciples was a zealot. But a real distinction from Jewish nationalism came with the Great Jewish Rising of 66 AD. This was the most important in the whole history of Jewry under the empire, when the extremists gained the upper hand in Judea and took over Jerusalem. The Jewish historian Josephus had recorded the atrocious struggle which followed: the final storming of the temple, the headquarters of resistance, and its burning after the Roman victory. Before this, the unhappy inhabitants had been reduced to cannibalism in their struggle to survive. Archaeology has recently revealed at Masada, a little way from the city, what may well have been the site of the last stand of the Jews before it too fell to the Romans in 73 AD. This was not the end of Jewish turbulence, but it was a turning point. The extremists never again enjoyed such support and must have been discredited. The law was now more than ever the focus of Jewishness for the Jewish scholars and teachers. After this time, they are more and more designated as rabbis, had continued to unfold its meanings in the centers of other than Jerusalem, while the revolt was in progress. Their good conduct may have saved these Jews of the dispersion. Later disturbances were never so important as had been the Great Revolt, though in 117 AD, Jewish riots in Cyrenaica developed into a full-scale fighting, and in 132 AD, the last Messiah, Simon Bar Kokhba launched another revolt in Judea, but the Jews emerged with their special status at law still intact. Jerusalem had been taken from them. Hadrian made it an Italian colony which Jews might enter only once a year, but their religion was granted the privilege of having a special officer, a patriarch with sovereignty over it, and they were allowed exemption from the obligations of Roman law, which might conflict with their religious duties. This was the end of a volume of Jewish history. For the next 1800 years, Jewish history was to be the story of communities of the diaspora until a national state again was established again in Palestine among the debris of another empire. The nationalists of Judea apart, Jews elsewhere in the empire were for a long time thereafter safe enough during the troubled years. Christians did less well, though their religion was not much distinguished from Judaism by the authorities. It was, after all, only a variant of Jewish monotheism with presumably the same claims to make. It was the Jews, not the Romans, who first persecuted it. As the crucifixion itself, the martyrdom of Stephen, and the adventures of Paul have shown. It was a Jewish king, Herod Agrippa, who, according to the author of the Acts of the Apostles, first persecuted the community at Jerusalem. It has even appeared plausible to some scholars that Nero, seeking a scapegoat for a great fire at Rome in 64 AD, should have had the Christians pointed out to him by hostile Jews. Whatever the source of this persecution, in which, according to popular Christian tradition, Saint Peter and Saint Paul both perished, and which was accompanied by horrific and bloody scenes in the arena, it seems to have been for a long time the end of any official attention by Rome to the Christians. They did not take up arms against the Romans in the Jewish revolts, and this must have soothed official susceptibilities with regard to them. When they emerge in the administrative records as worth notice by government, it is in the early 2nd century. This is because of the overt disrespect which Christians were by then showing in refusing to sacrifice to the emperor and the Roman deities. This was their distinction. Jews had a right to refuse. They had possessed a historic cult which the Romans respected, as they always respected such cults, when they took Judah under their rule. The Christians were now clearly seen as distinct from other Jews and were a recent creation. Yet the Roman attitude was that although Christianity was not legal, it should not be the subject of general persecution. If, on the other hand, breaches of the law were alleged and the refusal to sacrifice might be one, then the authorities should punish when the allegations were specific and shown in court to be well founded. This led to many martyrdoms as Christians refused the well intentioned attempts of the Roman civil servants to persuade them to sacrifice or abjure their God. But there was no systematic attempt to eradicate the sect. Indeed, the authorities' hostility was much less dangerous than that of the Christians' fellow subjects. As the 2nd century passed, there is more evidence of pogroms and popular attacks on Christians who were not protected by the authorities since they followed an illegal religion. They may sometimes have been acceptable scapegoats for the administration or lightning conductors diverting dangerous currents. It was easy for the popular mind of a superstitious age to attribute to Christians the offenses to the gods which led to famine, flood, plague, and other natural disasters. Other equally convincing explanations of these things were lacking in a world with no other technique for explaining natural disasters. Christians were alleged to practice black magic, incest, even cannibalism, an idea no doubt explicable in terms of misleading accounts of the Eucharist. They met secretly at night, more specifically and acutely, though we cannot be sure of the scale of this. The Christians threatened by their control of the other members the whole customary structure which regulated and defined the proper relations of parents and children, husbands and wives, masters and slaves. They proclaimed that in Christ there was neither bond nor free, and that he had come to bring not peace but a sundering sword to families and friends. It was prescient of pagans to sense danger in such views. Christianity's greatest contribution to a later Western civilization would be its stubbornly prophetic and individualistic assertion that life should be regulated with reference to a moral guidance, independent not only of the government but of any other merely human authority. It is not hard, therefore, to understand the violent outburst in the big provincial towns, such as that at Smyrna in 165 AD or Lyons in 177 AD. They were the popular aspect of an intensification of opposition to Christianity, which had an intellectual counterpart in the first attacks on the new cult by pagan writers. Persecution was not the only danger facing the early church. Possibly, it was the least grave. A much more serious one was that it might develop into such just another cult of the kind of which many examples could be seen in the Roman Empire, and in the end be engulfed like them in the magical morass of ancient religion. All over the Near East could be found examples of the mystery religions whose core was the initiation of the believer into the occult knowledge of a devotion centered on a particular god. The Egyptian Isis was a popular one, the Persian Mithras another. Almost always, the believer was offered the chance to identify himself with the divine being in a ceremony which involved a simulated death and resurrection, and thus to overcome mortality. Such cults offered through their impressiveness and rituals the peace and liberations from the temporal which many craved. They were very popular. That there was a real danger that Christianity might develop in this way is shown by the importance in the second century of the Gnostics. Their name derives from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge. The knowledge the Christian Gnostics claimed was a secret esoteric tradition not revealed to all Christians but only to a few. One version said only to the apostles and the sect to which it had subsequently descended. Some of their ideas came from Zoroastrianism, Hindu, and Buddhist sources, which stressed the conflict of matter and spirit in a way which distorted the Judeo Christian tradition. Some came from astrology and even magic. There was always a temptation in such a dualism, the attribution of evil and good to opposing principles and entities, and the denial of the goodness of the material creation. The Gnostics were haters of this world, and in some of their systems, this led to the pessimism typical of mystery cults. Salvation was only possible by the acquisition of arcane knowledge, secrets of an initiated elect. A few Gnostics even saw Christ not as the Savior who confirmed and renewed a covenant, but as one who delivered men from Yahweh's error. It was a dangerous creed in whatever form it came, for it cut at the roots of the hopefulness which was the heart of the Christian revelation. It turned its back on the redemption of the here and now, of which Christians could never wholly despair, since they accepted the Judaic tradition that God made the world and that it was good. In the second century, with its communities scattered throughout the diaspora and their organizational foundations fairly firmly settled, Christianity thus seems to stand at a parting of ways, either of which could prove fatal to it. Had it turned its back on the implications of Paul's work and remained merely a Jewish heresy, it would at best have been reabsorbed eventually into Judaic tradition. On the other hand, a flight from the Jewry, which rejected it, might have driven Christians into the Hellenistic world of the mystery cults or the despair of the Gnostics. Thanks to a handful of men, it escaped both and became a promise of salvation to the individual. The achievement of the fathers of the church who navigated these perils was, for all its moral and pietistic content, above all intellectual. They were stimulated by their danger. Irenaeus, who succeeded the martyred bishop of Lyons in 177 AD, provided the first great outline of Christian doctrine, a creed and definition of the scriptural canon. All of these set off Christianity from Judaism. But he wrote also against the background of the challenge of heretical beliefs. In 172 AD, the First Council had met to reject Gnostic doctrines. Christian doctrine was squeezed into intellectual respectability by the need to resist the pressures of competitors. Heresy and orthodoxy were born twins. One of the pilots who steered an emerging Christian theology through this period was the prodigiously learned Clement of Alexandria, a Christian Platonist, perhaps born in Athens, through whom Christians were brought to an understanding of what the Hellenistic tradition might mean apart from the mysteries. In particular, he directed Christians to the thought of Plato. To his even greater pupil, Origen, he transmitted the thought that God's truth was a reasonable truth, a belief which could attract men educated in the Stoic view of reality. The intellectual drive of the early fathers and the inherent social appeal of Christianity made it possible for it to utilize the huge possibilities of diffusion and expansion inherent in the structure of the classical and later Roman world. Its teachers could move freely and talk and write to one another in Greek. It had the great advantage of emerging in a religious age. The monstrous credulousness of the second century cloaks deep longings. They hint that the classical world is already running out of vigor. The Greek capital needed replenishment, and one place to look for it was in the new religions. Philosophy had become a religious quest, and rationalism and skepticism appealed only to an infinitesimally small minority. Yet, this promising setting was also a challenge to the church. Early Christianity has to be seen always in the context of thriving competitor. To be born in a religious age was a threat as well as an advantage. How successfully Christianity met the threats and seized its opportunity was to be seen in the crisis of the 3rd century, when the classical world all but collapsed and survived only by colossal and in the end mortal concession. Chapter 8, The Waning of the Classical West. After 200 AD, there are many signs that Romans were beginning to look back on the past in a new way. Men had always talked of the golden ages in the past, indulging in a conventional literary nostalgia. But the 3rd century brought something new, a sense of conscious decline. Historians have spoken of a crisis, but its most obvious expressions were, in fact, surmounted the changes Romans carried out or accepted by the year 300, gave a new lease of life to much of the classical Mediterranean civilization. They may even have been decisive in ensuring that it would, in the end, transmit so much of it to the future. Yet, the changes themselves took a toll, for most of them were essentially destructive of the spirit of that civilization. Restorers are often unconscious imitators. Somewhere around the beginning of the 4th century, we can sense that the balance has tipped against the Mediterranean heritage. It is easier to feel it than to see what was the crucial moment. The signs are a sudden multiplication of omnious innovations. The administrative structure of the empire is rebuilt on new principles. Its ideology is transformed. The religion of a once obscure Jewish sect becomes established orthodoxy, and physically, large tracts of territory are given up to settlers from the outside, alien immigrants. A century later, still, and the consequence of these changes is apparent in political and cultural disintegration. The ups and downs of imperial authority mattered a lot in this process. Classical civilization had come by the end of the 2nd century AD to be coterminous with the empire. It was dominated by the conception of Romanitas, the Roman way of doing things. Because of this, the weaknesses of the structure of government were fundamental to what was going wrong. The imperial office had long since ceased to be held, as Augustus had carefully pretended, by the agent of the Senate and people. The reality was a despotic monarch, his rule tempered only by such practical considerations as the placating of the Praetorian Guard on which he depended. A round of civil wars, which followed the accession of the last inadequate Antony, emperor, in 180, opened a terrible era. The wretched man, Commodus, was strangled by a wrestler at the bidding of his concubine and chamberlain in 192, but that solved nothing. From the struggles of four emperors in the months following his death, there finally emerged an African, Septimius Severus, married to a Syrian, who strove to base the empire again on heredity, attempting to link his own family with the Antonine succession and thus to deal with one fundamental constitutional weakness. This was really to deny the fact of his own success. Severus, like his rivals, had been the candidate of provincial army. Soldiers were the real emperor makers throughout the 3rd century, and their power lay at the root of the empire's tendency to fragment. Yet the soldiers could not be dispensed with. Indeed, because of the barbarian threat now present on several frontiers simultaneously, the army had to be enlarged and pampered. Here was a dilemma to face emperors for the next century. Severus's son, Caracalla, who prudently began his reign by bribing the soldiers heavily, was nonetheless murdered by them in the end. In theory, the Senate still appointed the emperor. In fact, it had little effective power except in so far as it could commit its prestige to one of a number of contending candidates. This was not much of an asset, but still had some importance so long as maintaining the old forms had some moral effect. It was inevitable, though, that the arrangements should intensify the latent antagonism of Senate and Emperor. Severus gave more power to officers drawn from the equestrian class and socially inferior to the senatorial families. Caracalla inferred that a purge of the Senate would help and took this further step towards autocratic rule. More military emperors followed him. Soon there was, for the first time, one who did not come from the senatorial ranks, though he was from the equites. Worse was to follow. In 235, Maximianus, a huge ex-ranker from the Rhine legions, contested the prize with an octogenarian from Africa who had the backing of the African army and eventually of the Senate. Many emperors were murdered by their troops. One died fighting his own commander in chief in battle, his conqueror subsequently being slain by the Goths after his betrayal of them by one of his other officers. It was a dreadful century. Altogether, 22 emperors came and went, and that number does not include mere pretenders or such semi emperors as Postumus, who for a while maintained himself in Gaul, thus prefiguring a later division of the empire. Though Severus's reforms had for a time improved matters, the fragility of his successor's position accelerated to decline in administration. Caracalla was the last emperor to try to broaden the basis of taxation by making all free inhabitants of the empire Roman citizens, and thus liable to inheritance taxes. But no fundamental fiscal reform was attempted. Perhaps decline was inevitable given the emergencies to be faced and the resources available. With irregularity and extemporization went growing rapacity and corruption as those with the power or office used it to protect themselves. This reflected another problem, the economic weakness which the empire was showing in the 3rd century. Few generalizations are safe about what this meant to the consumer and to the supplier. For all its elaboration and organization around a network of the cities, the economic life of the empire was overwhelmingly agrarian. Its bedrock was the rural estate, the villa, large or small, which was both the basic unit of production and also, in many places, of society. Such estates were the source of subsistence for all those who lived on them, and that meant nearly all the rural population. Probably, therefore, most people in the countryside were less affected by the long term swings of the economy than by the requisitioning and heavier taxation which resulted from the empire ceasing to expand. The armies had to be supported from a narrower base. Sometimes, too, the land was devastated by fighting. But peasants lived at subsistence level, had always been poor, and continued to be so, whether bond or free. At times got worse, some sought to bind themselves as serfs, which suggests an economy in which money was in retreat before payment in goods and services. It was probably reflective of another impact of troubled times, such as drove peasants to the towns or to banditry. Men everywhere sought protection. Requisitioning and higher taxation may, in some places, have helped to produce depopulation, though the 4th century provides more evidence of this than the 3rd, and to this extent were self defeating. In any case, they were likely to be inequitable, for many of the rich were exempt from taxation, and the owners of the estates cannot have suffered much in inflationary times unless they were imprudent. The continuity of many of the great estate owning families in antiquity does not suggest that the troubles of the 3rd century bit deeply into their resources. The administration and the army felt most of the effects of economic troubles, and particularly the major ill of the century, inflation. Its sources and extent of complex and still disputed. In part, it derived from an official debasement of the coinage, which was aggravated by the need to pay tribute in bullion to barbarians, who from time to time were best placated by this means. But barbarian incursions themselves often helped to dispute supply, and this again told against the cities where prices rose. Because the soldiers' pay was fixed, it fell in real value. This made them, of course, more susceptible to generals who offered lavish bribes. Although the overall impact is hard to assess, it has been suggested that money may have fallen during the century to about 1/5 of its value at the beginning. The damage showed both in the towns and in imperial fiscal practice. From the 3rd century onwards, many towns shrank in size and prosperity. Their early medieval successors were only pale reflections of the important places they once had been. One cause was the increasing demands of the imperial tax collectors. From the beginning of the 4th century, the depreciation of coin led imperial officials to levy taxes in kind. They could often be used directly to supply local garrisons, but were also the means of payment to civil servants. And this not only made the government more unpopular, but also the municipal office holders who had the task of raising these impositions. By 300, they often had to be forced to take office, a sure sign that a once sought after dignity had become a strenuous obligation. Some towns suffered from actual physical damage too, especially those in the frontier regions. Significantly, as the 3rd century wore on, towns well within the frontier began to rebuild or build for the first time walls for their protection. Rome began again to fortify itself soon after 270.